Well, the big meet of governors and politicians and economists of the World Bank and of the International Monetary Fund over here in Marrakesh is midway through all of the events which have actually been planned. This is an annual summit which has in a sense been overshadowed by the events in Israel. What sort of impact will that have? But also what are some of the larger, broader economic concerns which have been addressed or outlined over here. I'm joined by a very special guest. Martin Wolf is Chief Economic Commentator at the Financial Times, one of the most influential, best-known economic journalists, financial affairs journalists. Thanks very much, sir, for being with us. You know, the Israel situation is obviously something we're all looking at very, very closely. At what stage does this start having an economic impact in the region?
In the region rather than the world. Well, I think it's very early days. Obviously, at the moment, it's basically security and military and human affair. I think if it remains what it is today, basically a war between Israel and Hamas, its wider implications are likely to be very limited.
Right.
This is local. And so the key question is, does it spread and where? Even if Lebanon was to get involved, which is quite possible because of Hezbollah, I think it would still not have wider economic implications, so it would still become a very much bigger issue. It becomes really serious if Iran gets involved.
Yes.
And are there any circumstances, I've been wondering, in which Israel would say, well, Iran was responsible for this, and we're going to attack Iran? And even more, what happens if the Americans were to support them? It seems all very remote. In that situation, it would seem to me the potential for a wider conflagration. If Iran feels attacked, who would it then attack? Could it be stretched into the Persian Gulf more broadly? At that stage, it becomes really unpredictable, but it's in no way where we are now. But if it becomes a wider war in the oil fields of the world, of course it's significant.
You know, just in the last couple of months, there's been a lot of conversation about an economic corridor stretching from India through the Middle East. The idea was for it to ultimately end up in Israel. Given the rhetoric that we are seeing from the Saudis and the Qataris, who have taken a very clear pro-Palestine position, a time-honored position for them, do you believe that all talk of that has essentially evaporated?
Well, my assumption is that if you look at the attack, if you assume that Hamas was at least partly influenced by Iranians, the Iran regime, but also by people who are really concerned about the consequences of the rapprochement between Israel and the Gulf states, then that seems to me the strategic objective of this attack. This is what it was for. It's clearly not going to make the position of the people in Gaza any better. It's not going to eliminate Israel. That's just not going to happen. But it can break down this emerging rapprochement between Israel and those states. So I assume that's the objective, and they don't care how many people die in the process. And it looks to be very likely that they will be successful in that objective. So they push the region back into confrontation with very unknown and unknowable longer-term consequences.
Now that's a very important point, because one of the things that Tel Aviv really wanted was to secure a proper equation with the Arab world. The fact that America really pushed India to an extent as well in getting the Saudis to actually speak, would have been difficult for the Palestinians to handle, because then the entire issue of Palestinian statehood would essentially have disappeared from, the international agenda, as it were. So you are directly linking it then, that the events which have taken place now are an effort to sort of scuttle, a bid to get Israel closer to the Arab world.
I've always assumed, I think it's always a good point, I'm an economist, to assume that people who do things do it for reasons that are rational, that have a purpose. I'm not saying that's necessarily always the case, and I certainly have no intelligence on Hamas. But it seems to me from the beginning that the objective was twofold. One, to convince the Israelis that they're not safe and secure without paying attention to the Palestinian issue. That was an objective. Whether they will be successful or not, I don't know. And second, to make it clear to the Arab world that they cannot ignore the Palestinian cause in making a rapprochement with this very dynamic and powerful little Jewish state.
Right.
And those are perfectly rational objectives from Hamas's point of view. Even if they lose the war, they will lose the war, and even if Gaza is terribly punished. And that fallout seems to me predictable, rationally expected, and it appears to me
is that economic
and
corridor.
Quite likely that the whole rapprochement will go, and in this case, of course, the economic corridor that you described will become very much more difficult.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about what the IMF has been saying about the global economy. We are an Indian network, and so I must ask you, since we have a huge viewership back home, India is a bit of an outlier, a significant outlier, I'd say 6.3% GDP growth, that's up 0.2%. You've followed the G20 process very, very closely indeed. What are some of the underlying areas on the basis of which India is able to achieve this growth rate?
Well, I would make two comments on this. First is, I regard India's 6% growth as very disappointing. I think India should grow at 8 or 9% a year, as China did at this stage of its development. That used to be the ambition of Indian governments, and I think it should still be. India has huge challenges and huge potential. But of course, India is doing better than other parts of the world because it has some very important assets. It has huge growth potential in many ways, which is obvious in terms of its size, capacity for leapfrogging in technology and all the rest of it. It is in a favorable geopolitical position. The West is very favorably inclined towards it. And of course, China, the BRICS want to include it. It's really an important power. It's going to benefit from China plus one in a significant way. And so I feel, and in addition to having access to world markets, it has a huge domestic market. So with lots and lots of young people who are dynamic and educated. So the assets of India are unique, and it ought to be doing better than anybody else. And it is doing better than anybody else. But as I said, I think it could be doing even better.
Our political leaders say India in a finite period of time will be the third largest economy in the world. Do you think that's a realistic statement?
Yes. I mean, it ought to be.
Just in terms of the macro numbers.
That would mean, yes, but that would mean essentially it would pass Japan.
Yes.
And Japan is a country which is about 100 million and shrinking. It hasn't grown very fast for 30 years. India is a country of 1.45 billion or something like that.
1.4,
yeah. Going up.
Yeah.
It ought to be the third largest. And I expect it to become the third largest fairly soon. Yes, why not? Of course.
Yeah. A lot of people suggest that India's biggest strength is our demographic dividend, the fact that we are the most populous country in the world now, but also because we've got a very young population. How does that link in with economic growth?
I think it's true, but I would emphasize, and every Indian knows this, it's a potential rather than necessarily a reality. You have the potential to grow more with more young people, but they have to be employed.
Yeah,
there have to be jobs.
Yes.
They have to be highly educated so they can be productive when they work. And the truth is, this is no mystery, everybody knows, the jobs performance of the Indian economy is one of its weak spots.
Yeah.
And everybody knows this from a growth point of view, but even more from a human welfare point of view. The jobs performance of India needs to be improved dramatically, and that's why I say the growth rate should be raised. That would create more jobs, more opportunity, and then you get a virtuous circle. India's save enough, they can invest enough. The government deficit is too big. That's a big problem. It needs to be cut, so it goes into productive investment. But I would say, yes, you have the opportunity, but as many of my Indian friends would tell me, well, the potential isn't the reality. And that, if the Indian government were to ask me, getting jobs, creating jobs for men and women.
And skilling.
Are the biggest priorities for Indian development in the short, medium and long term.
Yeah. Digitalization is something which has been a part of our economic backbone. In the last couple of years, there's the technology end of it, and then there's the experience associated with having digitalization as a big priority. Can that seriously be replicated, as India suggests, in other parts of the world? Because that's been a big focus at G20.
I think it's a great achievement. It's been achieved over 2 successive governments, and I must always mention my dear friend Nandan Nilekani, which is a tremendous achievement, but he put in place, after all, under Manmohan Singh, and carried on forward. It's a great achievement. I think because India's done it, it knows how to do it, it's shown how to do it. There are many countries around the world, developing and indeed developed, which could imitate this. I think in Britain we could do with this. Really, I'm quite serious about this. But of course, the potential to use it in other parts of the developing and emerging world, in Asia, in Africa, must exist. And India has the people to help. So I think it's a unique development achievement. It won't solve all development problems. You need manufacturing, you need food, you need real stuff. It's not digital, but the potential for financial inclusion that it creates is extraordinary. So it is the best thing, I think, that India has managed to create in the last 3 decades.
Financial inclusion, you use those words. We are, of course, in Africa, in Morocco. The G20 process has focused a great deal on financial inclusion, and inclusion of the African Union as part of the G20 process. Again, in terms of some of the efforts being made by India, reform of multilateral banks is a series of documents NK Singh has been working on very closely. Financial inclusion, how is that a key sort of objective of India and something that we're working at very closely?
Well, it's clearly a very key objective. I would stress there are 2 different aspects of this, which you've touched on. One is making finance available to ordinary people. So moving beyond a financial world which is basically just for elites. And I think that's an absolutely essential thing in terms of human rights, but also in terms of the development process. And India can lead there, because I think India's made huge progress. I think there are a lot of problems with it. Financial inclusion, can you contain fraud and all the rest of it. Then there's the other aspect, which is the inclusion of the world in the global discussion of finance, which is what the G20 was about, what these meetings here are about. I think India was wise to include the African Union, even though it's a strange body, because Africa needs to be represented. It is a huge number of people. They need to be part of the discussion. This is a good way to include them. So I think this was all very, very sensible. And it's obvious to everybody that the structures of these multilateral institutions need to be changed to be more inclusive of the world as a whole and not be so dominated by the G7, which as they are. And India is a potentially important player as a big country in its own right. As an emerging country, it can be an important catalyst for this. I think it has to be done not in a confrontational way, but in a way where we say we have common problems in the world which we have to tackle. Very difficult in this environment because of the growing confrontation in the West and China, but India is better positioned, I think, than any other country to lead this discussion. So I'm completely behind it.
A final question. Climate is such an important part of this summit. I was listening to Ajay Banga, the World Bank president, today, where he spoke about extreme weather events having a direct impact on the global economy. What is your assessment of the direct link that we are now seeing? We would not have been discussing this even, say, 5 or 6 years back.
So my honest answer is, I don't know. It's very difficult to connect it directly. I would say we're at the stage when the human consequences are less obvious than the gross economic consequences. And even if we get to the point where it starts creating dramatic effects on, for instance, food production, the aggregate GDP consequences might look quite small. So I would emphasize, in the first place, climate is about the livability of the planet for human beings. And, of course, other creatures. I think it's broader than that. But I do expect that if the climate continues to move the way it is now, that the economic effects might become measurable. But there is a large part of economic activity, very large part, in countries and with technologies and things we do which won't be immediately affected by climate. So don't just worry about that. Worry about things that are even more important, namely how human beings can live.
Absolutely. Wonderful speaking to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Great pleasure.
Martin Wolf over there talking about some of the broader concerns globally as far as the economy is concerned. The India growth story, he expects India to do better than we are doing now, but overall optimistic. And certainly the concerns that everyone has at the moment on the war in West Asia. It's time now for us to take a short break. There's more coming up.